Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Hello, and welcome to Thriving While Aching, a podcast that inspires and offers insights on how to live a fuller life while navigating the challenges of pain. Last season, we went deeply into the journeys of adults who are finding joy and purpose while continuing to live with the inevitable aches of aging. This season, we turn the spotlight onto the unsung heroes of many of those stories, the caregivers and care partners who empower their loved ones to thrive, whether that's through nature escapades, preserving cherished family memories, or expressing themselves in art or music. And this season, Mike Eidsaune will be here to reflect, share from his wealth of experience, and offer invaluable advice. So, whether you're a caregiver or know someone who is, this season is for you. Let's dive in. Today, I'm excited to introduce a truly inspiring guest, Aisha. Aisha is a young caregiver who embarked on an unexpected journey when her mother was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. With incredible tenacity and dedication, she navigated the unique challenges that were posed by her youth and cultural background, filling gaps in available resources by creating a community for those who were caregiving as she was. Today, she shares her deeply personal story, the lessons she's learned, and the hope she's found along the way. Hi, Aisha.
Hi, Lori.
It's great to have you on the podcast, Thriving While Aching, and I'm just delighted that you're able to be here. So one of the things we talk about is what it's like to be a caregiver for someone you love, and I know that's been a big part of your journey. And if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be a caretaker.
Certainly. Well, when I was about 27, my mother was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. I had never heard of the term before. I knew very little about dementia, but I did know that things like wandering were prone to occur and that folks who were diagnosed with any form of dementia often benefited from someone being in the home with them. I had just started my first big girl job, and after a conversation with my father, we determined that between the two of us, it made the most sense for me to stay home. My father needed to maintain health insurance since my mother was only 57 at the time of diagnosis, as frontotemporal degeneration is the number one form of dementia for those under the age of 60. And it just made the most sense for me to take on a role. I did not know the term caregiver or caretaker or care partner going into it. I just knew that I needed to be there with my mother as she exhibited severe personality changes and confusion, memory loss, and all of these symptoms that we often associate with cognitive impairment or decline.
Oh, Aisha, that just sounds so incredibly difficult.
It certainly was. This was a very foreign territory for my family and myself, and certainly something that I would not say I was well equipped to encounter.
The title of the podcast is Thriving While Aching, and some of it is heartache when you're a caregiver and alongside that I can imagine. So you left your job, you stayed home, and what was it like for you?
Well, it's interesting. Initially, I looked at myself as a companion, someone to kind of keep an eye on my mother, help her with cooking and cleaning and making sure that she remained safe while doing those activities. She always loved to cook, was a phenomenal baker, had her own baking company. And so I assisted with those sorts of activities. As the disease progressed, those tasks became more involved. So it included things like financial management and eventually assistance with activities of daily living, like bathing and feeding and dressing. And as her mobility decreased, that also included helping her walk and then eventually transfer from bed to wheelchair, from wheelchair to shower, etc. And, as the disease finally reached its final stages, it returned. It was sort of full cycle to that companionship once she entered hospice care. And today actually marks the 2-month mark since her passing.
Oh, my. What an incredible journey. And I know that you were very young. And one of the things that you've said is it was challenging to find any kind of resources to help support you.
Oh, 100%. So much of the material, particularly with a condition like frontotemporal degeneration is geared toward older care partners. So those caring for a spouse or a slightly older loved one, although this is an early onset form of the disease, anything really within the realm of dementia and cognitive impairment is not only geared at older folks, but particularly those who are potentially more affluent than I was at, someone entering my first job. I certainly didn't have the resources to support my parents in the way that maybe someone who's older and more established in their career and their financial standing might. Very culturally, I would say, non-specific materials. I think that people experience illness and experience care through the lens of their cultural experience and their lived experience. And I found that much of the material that was available was not tailored to my experience as an African-American young woman. And so being able to find spaces where I felt as though I could relate to the materials proved to be very difficult in the beginning. And it certainly is still challenging today.
So Aisha, tell me a little more about what it was like to not find those resources that you needed and what you did about it.
Certainly. While not being able to pinpoint resources that reflected my needs as a Black woman, as a young person, was really challenging and something that was, quite frankly, very discouraging. Just not being able to quickly grab a hold of something that would be helpful for my family was very disheartening at the time.
Understandably.
So that being said, I really set out to create what I could not find in the void. And so at the time, I came up with an idea to develop a support system specifically for young millennials of color and those who belong to the LGBTQ community, because there is also a missing aspect there. And I created Our Turn to Care, which is a support system and had resource guides for financial resources as well as a support group. And eventually we merged with the Love Labor Project, where we had weekly support groups. And it really was a sea change for me, being able to tap into people and resources that reflected in a more accurate way the experience that I was having, not having access to the financial resources or the social support that I desperately needed. Eventually, I connected with Caring Across Generations, which is a policy advocacy organization that fights to gain better access to resources for family caregivers, people with disabilities, and older adults across the US through policy change, through culture change, and through organizing. And I've really found opportunities to uplift these communities in ways that I hadn't previously been able to. And it has really been empowering for me, and being able to really provide a safe space to discuss the challenges that we experience as a nation, many of which are overlapping and intersectional, but really to be able to discuss those as a Black woman and the unique perspective that I hold was really, really important to me. And being able to do that with Caring Across has been really an experience that was life-changing. I will say that the financial pieces of the support that I was looking for, it was really kind of a shocker. There's this widespread understanding across the US that when you turn 65, you just kind of receive everything that you've ever needed, right? And that's a misunderstanding I think a lot of people have, namely that Medicare does not cover long-term care. This is something that many people are very, very surprised to discover. Medicaid is the number one provider of long-term care in this country in terms of what is government funded. And so unfortunately, unless you are eligible for Medicaid, meaning your income is below a certain threshold, which varies from state to state, you're really stuck kind of in the middle. And that's where my family found itself with collective income really pricing us out of being able to tap into some of these long-term supports and services until we discovered Medicaid waivers that are available in various states. I'm located in the state of Georgia, and thankfully through some deep research and a lot of support from subject matter experts in the area, I was able to make sure that my mother was eligible actually for this particular Medicaid waiver, and she was eventually able to receive in-home care. But every few months or so was certainly a journey in making sure that she remained eligible, making sure that she got the number of hours that she needed, making sure that there was enough help available, because we also know that direct care workers are woefully underpaid. do not have access to things like health insurance and paid leave for themselves. And so there is a shortage of care jobs that are really worthwhile for a lot of people. It's not so much that there's a direct care worker shortage. It's the jobs really do not provide the stability that people need in order to live and to raise their families and to provide for their own aging loved ones and those with disabilities. And so it's really about the systems of care being in desperate need of repair. And being able to be a part of those conversations has really lifted my spirits and given me purpose.
Aisha, you bring up so many important points here. And the one that I really want to focus on is what you've brought up about there being a lack of caregiving resources that are geared towards not only young people, but also Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those from the LGBTQ community as well. I'm here with Mike Eidsaune, our expert caregiver. And Mike's here to give some of his insight and deeper support for caregivers and their loved ones as they navigate their journey. Mike, what are some of your thoughts on that particular point about that lack of resources geared toward particular caregivers?
For family caregivers, one of the key things to be able to find resources or identify resources that fit your needs is one, being able to see yourself in the solution being provided. And I think this is what sort of Aisha speaks to really, really well, is this lack of representation and frankly, just tailoring the solutions and tailoring the message so that it feels more relevant to a specific population of people is really key. It's one of the areas we at caregiving.com have tried to expand on, even with our own content on our site, but there's a lot of work. And I think part of the challenge that you face here is that no one caregiver is alike. When you've met one caregiver, you've met one caregiver. And that obviously presents a huge challenge for us in the industry who are trying to sort of solve and fill these knowledge gaps. But it also presents a tremendous opportunity to create real impact and to create real positive change if we can really embrace this idea of tailoring our messages, tailoring our solutions to the specific audience that we're trying to reach. We can have a much bigger impact at the end of the day. The reality for family caregiving support in the country is that it's looked the exact same for 20 years. It's the same articles, it's the same resources, it's the same associations putting out the same articles and the same resources over and over again. That becomes very void in the space, and frankly, it leaves people feeling very lost. It leaves them feeling isolated, as Aisha mentions. So I think for me, that's one of the areas. And frankly, the response I would give to family caregivers is you have to find it yourself, unfortunately, in your community. And rather than turn to those national associations that you would sort of expect to have your back or expect to have the resources for you, you really just need to turn towards your community and find others who are in a similar position. And that's one of the areas, again, that we at caregiving.com are trying to do more of, which is that community connection piece. And Aisha is a big part of that.
So Aisha, this is such a tremendous story. And as I listen, I'm sitting here just marveling at the strength you have, the grit, the persistence to do all that research and that reaching out to get what you needed to find it in your community, even at a time when you were providing care for your mother. But there's so much there around the need that caregivers have for not just emotional support, but the financial support and the sort of surround of how nobody can do this all by themselves.
100%. You hear the old adage that it takes a village. It's really, that's not a misnomer. That's really something that is very true. It takes a strong and fortified network of people who have the knowledge and the resources themselves to really be of proper support. Many people will say, oh, anything that I can do to help. But the reality is it does take a certain amount of expertise, a certain amount of insider knowledge to navigate these government systems, the forms, the phone calls, so many pieces and components that come into play. And I am very privileged to have a network like that.
Well, you're privileged to have it, and you are amazingly self-startered to create it, because it sounds like you created it not just for yourself, but for others as well. And I'm hearing in that you were very clear that gave you a sense of empowerment, which is something I think caregivers can start to feel frustrated or stuck. And you really found ways to keep yourself alive and motivated as you were caring for your mother. We're thinking about thriving while aching in this podcast. And so I know that you were alongside helping your mother thrive. What were you say were some of the things that the two of you enjoyed doing together that kind of kept your spirits up and kept her spirits up?
Well, that's a great question. Music and the arts have always played a big role in my family and have always been a part of the way that we spent time together. And so that certainly did not change over the course of my mother's disease progression. And so we certainly incorporated a lot of singing, a lot of listening to oldies and old school music, and gospel also played a significant role in fortifying our faith as a family as well, and really spending that quality time. Everything from, coloring books for adults to watercolor painting. These are the sort of things that really brought a lot of peace. And early on in her disease, being able to go to, live performances and enjoy that as well. These are tools and methodologies that have been shown to also have a positive effect on those impacted with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. And so we really ran with that and leaned into that piece of our lives together and spend a lot of time just really enjoying the arts. I know that television stations like PBS, for example, have phenomenal, programming that's free and available that we really enjoyed and appreciated. Nature was also something that we took a lot of joy in, and we live in a condominium, but there's a green belt behind us, and there are a lot of creatures and just beautiful sounds from birds. And so these seem like relatively insignificant, kind of everyday, ordinary things, but they are things that became such integral parts of our lives, and something that we really began to cling to, particularly as my mother progressed in her disease and as her cognition began to decline. Music in particular was something that remained a constant even until her last days, that really always uplifted her spirit. The melodies were something she could always connect to. And so it was really something beautiful that we could hold on to and enjoy together as a family.
Aisha, if I could, I'd love to jump in. I think what you're talking about is so beautiful. This idea of finding not only commonality, something that you can both enjoy together, but you're touching on something that for the last 5 to really 10 years, our industry has been discovering has tremendous scientific backing. This idea of music therapy in dementia has gotten a ton of research and a ton of light shed on it in the last 5 years. And there's even some great solutions out there that specifically speak to your situation and how family caregivers can utilize tools like SingFit and others to actually drive really meaningful impact and improvement in cognition and behavior and outcome in many ways. So incredible job that you sort of, through your experience and through your research, were able to identify that. I think one of the other interesting aspects and challenges family caregivers face is they don't necessarily have the insight that you or I do into what's available out there. So navigating resources, navigating systems in order to identify these solutions can be a real barrier for folks. It's one of the things that we're trying to tackle at caregiving.com. But with a little bit of Google sleuthing, I think you can find things like this that help address the challenges that many of us face every day when we're providing the care and doing the tasks that are required of us. So kudos to you. And also, I think one of the things that a lot of family caregivers that are listening can take away from this and apply to their own everyday sort of situation.
Oh, entirely. It's certainly, I am a big fan of, music therapy and really, the idea of forest bathing and sound baths and all of these different methodologies really provided some much needed therapeutic soothing for me as well as I went on this journey.
Because that, again, I'm hearing that even as you were in this challenging time, you really were taking care of yourself in some significant ways and needed to do that to have the resources to help your mother thrive.
Oh, certainly. It's certainly something that I needed to learn how to do over time. I would say during really the majority of the time that I spent taking care of my mother, I failed to seek out and maintain ways to care for myself. And I finally reached a point where I realized if I am not well and if I am not looking after myself, then I can't be fully present for my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really did begin probably about year 7 or so to be intentional about the ways that I took care of myself. And included in that was, again, these tools like nature and music and the arts overall. And it made a tremendous difference. It didn't mean that the challenges disappeared, but it did provide an outlet and a source of joy.
And a source of joy is so essential when you're on that journey, both for you and for the person you're caring for. To have that, that really is part of the definition of thriving, to have some joy. So you've been on a long journey. You've created resources. You've helped others access resources. You've done an amazing job. What would be some advice or wisdom that you would share with those who are in the caregiving shoes right now?
Such an important question because there are so many answers that vary based on one's individual experience, right? But that being said, I would always say that it's vitally important to prioritize, yourself as a caregiver, to prioritize your own wellness, even if it's something as simple as making sure that you remain hydrated, right? That seems again like a very simple thing, but something that you can do for yourself. And I think really seeking out ways that you can take 5 minutes a day to just have a moment of peace, a moment of meditation, a moment of prayer, listening to a favorite song, listening to podcast, anything that you can do to kind of turn inward for a brief moment, I've found makes a difference. The journey can be very difficult at times, but I think in addition to taking care of yourself, many times caregivers, particularly those who are maybe children caring for their adult parents or other aging loved ones, can experience resentment or bitterness about the circumstances that they're in. And, I certainly understand that relationships do vary, but I know one of the biggest lessons that I learned probably around I would say year 6 or so, was that I had one set of parents and I needed to be as present as possible for their lives. And that opportunities like job opportunities and opportunities to engage with my peers in different ways would hopefully come around again. And I'd have the opportunity to have a career that I'm proud of and to go to concerts or whatever it was that I felt as though I was missing at the time, particularly in my 20s. I realized that, gosh, I don't get a do-over. I don't get another chance to spend this time with my parents, as challenging as it may be. And so I really, at that moment, reprioritized that time and reprioritized my role as a caregiver and began to look at it as a gift rather than as much of a burden. That didn't mean that I wasn't very tired at times and that it wasn't incredibly emotional, but I was able to really find the gratitude that I think was missing early on before I guess I reached a level of maturity that helped me to understand the importance of the time that I had and how precious it was.
And one of the things I'm hearing, Aisha, that I think is also important to this caregiver journey is that it's not a straight line. There's a learning curve, there's an arc to it, and there are days that are better than others, there are months that are better than others, and then there are dips, and then you learn something. I'm hearing a lot of wisdom from you about really sort of being patient with yourself, how you reframe your attitudes. You said you had to sort of learn to prioritize yourself when you realized you'd really kind of run out of gas, run out of juice to do what was needed and had to kind of recalibrate. So I really appreciate that sort of learning arc that you're describing.
Absolutely, Lori. Just as with grief or with any other journey, it is indeed not linear. And being able to understand that and to give yourself grace around that and to understand that as humans, we may experience things differently than the human next to us, and that's okay. And that this journey may look very different for different people for a number of reasons, whether it is access to resources, whether it is your lived experience and individual identity. But understanding your journey and becoming more comfortable with it is really key to having the best experience possible.
Aisha, thank you so much for sharing all of this lived experience and wisdom with us as we think about being caregivers and helping our loved ones thrive and then thriving ourselves. We appreciate your time, all that you've shared. I want to conclude this conversation with you by asking if you could share the resources that our listeners might find helpful.
Oh, certainly. There is Caring Across Generations, which is great for policy and advocacy work and taking action to make change to our systems. There's the National Alliance for Caregiving at caregiving.org that does some really incredible work and has a number of accessible resources available. There's also caregiving.com, which has a number of resources available and support systems as well that have been very helpful. Hilarity for Charity has some wonderful support groups as well. So I would say those are probably my top resources at the moment and things that I've found helpful in my journey.
Thank you. And one of the things I appreciate certainly from your research is that these are resources that have spaces for many different kinds of caregivers for many different situations. And so they'll be very accessible regardless of the situation our listeners find themselves in and where they come from.
100%.
Thank you.
It's been my pleasure and honor to share this space with you, and I appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
So, Mike, I know you have a lot of information and expertise in these particular areas that Aisha's been talking about, particularly navigating complex systems. And I'm wondering what your takeaways from some of the conversation have been.
With Aisha, having worked with her, having been a fan of hers for a long time, and just her evolution as an advocate, one of the things I think a lot of caregivers can do to improve their situation and frankly just improve their own experience is educating yourself about the condition, for one, just understanding what that progress looks like. There's so much information out there about conditions themselves, which I think can be an incredible asset to family caregivers. Beyond that, Aisha's done an incredible job of navigating resources, which is a little bit more difficult. A lot of resources can be state-based, county-based, condition-based. She talked about Medicaid waivers. That's a mountain of a challenge to climb in itself. But finding your community, again, and we've touched on this before in previous episode, finding your community can be a big advantage there as well, too. So finding folks that have been through similar situation and leaning on their experience as your own to help you get up to speed a little bit quicker, that can be really important. And I think then lastly, the big takeaway from Aisha, and I think it's everybody who comes into contact with Aisha, is just what's possible. When you take it on directly and aggressively and as assertively as she has, something really beautiful can come out of it. And for her, it was an entire career. And it's an entire mission now that she's dedicated herself to, which is really amazing to see, especially with someone so young, being willing to sort of jump into this space that typically doesn't have a lot of folks that look like her. I think that that's really amazing to see and inspiring.
And I'm inspired by something you've talked about in another episode, and that's the importance of positivity. Her willingness to embrace all kinds of ways of supporting her mother, not just activities of daily living, which obviously is important, but the willingness to art and music and open up those things that were still meaningful, nature, the things that were meaningful to her, but the positive attitude that she brought to it is inspiring to me. And the other thing that I want all of us to just sort of take a breath about is, she helps us really understand the complexity that caregiving can have when you get into these complicated areas of finance and payments and insurance. And we're sort of hearing her at this point in her story, but I imagine, and you've counseled this all the way along, Mike, she took it step by step. She didn't start with the mountain, she started with the steps. And that caregivers, not to get overwhelmed by all that takes, but to know just sort of day by day, piece by piece, you can move forward in the way she has.
Oh, that's such a good point. The challenges can seem very insurmountable if you look at them all at once. But, she's a perfect example of, if you just lay it all out and then just tackle one item at a time on your list, you can get through it. And there's a lot of examples of caregivers that have done that. And so looking for those examples and then just, again, taking it step by step, you can really break it down. And all of a sudden, what felt like an impossibility and a drowning sensation can turn to a breath of fresh air.
And as you have said repeatedly, and I think we can't say it enough, that one of the things that can help us do that is the support of our communities, to look around, and maybe it's support that's right physically there, but maybe it's support you get in other ways, as Aisha has done. And so I think just support helps you navigate and manage as a caregiver. And to conclude today's conversation, in this season of Thriving While Aching, we've decided to close each episode by providing suggestions of tools that family caregivers can use. So, Mike, why don't you tell us about the tools you can suggest after listening to our guest today?
One of the amazing aspects of Aisha's story is the willingness to go deep and to dig in and identify where there might be a knowledge gap that exists. For family caregivers, we aren't trained in this process. We're not trained in the journey of being a family caregiver, identifying all the gaps in knowledge that, likely are only going to be known to a doctor or a nurse practitioner. So for Aisha to go deep on both condition and what resources are available for her mom and her state, I think that speaks to the power that family caregivers have. That can be intimidating for a lot of folks, but if we just start If we just start the process, we'll find that that information is actually readily available to us. It just takes a little bit of online sleuthing. A good place to start in your state, obviously on Google, is by looking up the Area Agency on Aging, the Department of Health Services. Those websites usually offer some good navigational points on where to look for resources and information about Medicare coverage or Medicaid solutions or support. Beyond that, most states have branches or chapters of national associations. So Area Agencies on Aging, I mentioned, was one. The Alzheimer's Association has state chapters. AARP has state chapters. Caregiving.com, we offer a lot of local and geographical-based resources. Finding those can be a little bit more effort, but just by starting at some of the national and then working your way down, you can typically find information that's more relevant to you as an individual in your state.
We hope that you found this episode inspiring. We want to thank Aisha for sharing her experience and insight, and we hope our discussion will help shed a light on the important role of caregivers in patients' journeys. And of course, we want to thank you, our listeners. We believe that the journey of caregiving is as unique as each person it touches, and we are inspired by our guests, who are such marvelous examples of helping their loved ones thrive. We encourage you to keep the conversation going, sharing your experience and questions with us by reaching out at podcasts@ghlf.org and be a part of our thriving community. Be sure to check out the toolkit for caregivers that Mike has shared at the end of each episode. For more enriching content and resources, visit the show page at ghlf.org/listen. This podcast is made possible with support from Kenvue, sponsor of the Global Healthy Living Foundation. Until next time, may you and your loved ones thrive with unwavering strength and grace.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.